Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Blast from the Past. Hell's aspiring angel takes on her demonic doppelganger in this action-packed, time-traveling E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Blast from the Past with a bonus E-Steam comic book, No Good Deed, in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere.
Hi everyone, it's Sean here with another comic review video. Now, back when I was in high school in the late 80s, I used to pick up Archie Digest and Archie Double Digest from my local newsstand and from a cigar store on Fordham Road here in the Bronx. And I would pick up these Archie Digest and Double Digest for two reasons. One, because back when I was in high school, I aspired to be a comic book writer, and I wanted to know everything about comics, so I would read almost every comic out here, because back then I had a goal that if I ever got a job assigned to writing a comic, I wanted to have all of the characters' backstories so I could jump into those characters, whether they be at Marvel, whether they be at DC, whether they be at some of these indies or at Archie Comics. And I wanted to have a good sense of the characters and the sense of the characters' voices, so I would sit there and read these comics on the regular. Now, the other reason why I would go out here and get these Archie comics is because they oftentimes provided a good laugh, and that was something I really enjoyed having in between reading the really dark adventure books like your Batman back then, and books like Iron Man and West Coast Avengers and Captain America. Yeah, I enjoyed action and adventure comics, but I also enjoyed humor comics as well. And when I saw the Kickstarter for Way Out Life of Riley, I really was reminded of all of those old Archie Digest I used to own back in the late 80s and the early 90s. And that was one of the reasons why I put in my pledge for The Way Out Life of Riley, because I wanted to go and experience a comic that was a lot like those old Archie comics that I used to read during the late 80s and the early 90s. And Your Way Out Life of Riley, I will say, does a great job of capturing the spirit of the Dan DeCarlo art style that is considered to be one of the definitive styles for Archie comics. And your Jeff Schultz does a fantastic job on the art on Way Out Life of Riley. I mean, his art, it's basically just like those old Archie comics from the 80s, and it really has that energy of that old Dan DeCarlo style that defined Archie for decades before we got the recent Archie reboot, where all of that classic DeCarlo Archie style was moved over to Digest and is no longer a part of the monthly Archie books. So I was happy with Jeff Schultz's art in this book. Unfortunately, story is a major problem for Jeff Schultz as related to creating comics. And his problems with story really start with the cover, where we get the introduction to the Way Out Life of Riley. But this cover, while it shows us a great homage to the Archie 1 comic strip from the late 60s, does not really leave a strong first impression on a new reader. Now, this was a comic that was crowdfunded, and when you're doing a crowdfunded comic, you want to leave a strong first impression on the reader, not only because this is your first book, but because you want to go out here and sell your next project. And this homage to Archie 1, while it's great for people who know Archie 1, it's not really good for new readers who are just getting used to this brand new character. When you're introducing a brand new character to readers, you really want to have that brand new character brought to the forefront in a way that leaves a powerful first impression on them. And while the art here on the cover is nice, it just doesn't tell the right story that's going to be able to sell the next Way Out Life of Riley book, and it's not going to leave the impression on the reader that's going to sell the next book. Because on this cover we get Riley and her friend, and Riley is in the background and she needs to be at the forefront. And if you're selling a book, again, you really want to have that strong first impression on the readers so that they go, this Riley character, she has to be somebody, has to be interesting, and it has to really fit into the story. Because when I look at this cover, I'm thinking, oh, it's a prehistoric book. But when I flip over to the next page, we get a book that's all Archie high school style, and that should be what should be on the cover of the book, because you're trying to sell the reader your book. I mean, people are putting in pledges because they wanted an Archie style book, and they wanted an Archie style book that would give them a strong impression. That's what they wanted, but the cover does not do that job as related to selling the book. So this is one of the big problems that starts out from the beginning, and those problems get a lot worse as we get into the next story. Now, the first, you have three stories in this Life of Riley book, and the first story, which is supposed to kick off the book and introduce the characters, has a lot of problems here. I mean, on the half splash, we get introduced to Riley, but Riley is not at the forefront. She's very passively in the mid-ground when she needs to be at the foreground, and she needs to be somebody we have focus on. Because when you're having main characters, you really want the readers to really see the main character, and we need to see that main character up front so that we know who this book is about, what is their objective, and why should we care. So we've got Riley and her best friend Groovy, who is kind of a 60s-esque version of Jughead Jones, but we're not really seeing what's important about them as related to the art. And this is very similar to a lot of old Archie and Betty and Veronica books, but you just have to understand character placement in order to make a scene work. In this one, the introduction is a little off, and that really keeps the book from going strong. Now, this story, it starts out introducing us to the characters, and then we get a bit of as the story goes along. It's a typical Archie-esque story. Riley runs after meeting up with her friend. They go into school. She runs into the guy she's going to talk to, and then the so-called hot chick, the Veronica Lodge type, gets in the way. And after this is where the story just starts to get really awkward. We start to get all of these different types of scenes. We get the Archie 1 vignette. We get this kind of scene where this guy's talking about, a crab on somebody's hair, and they're racing things, and this really disrupts the flow of the story. And again, this is somebody's first book with this creator, and this is not how you leave a strong first impression on the creator when the first story is just filled with this type of stuff in here, these inserts, and it just really does not come together. So you have problems here, and it's on the third page, and as the story goes on, we get this story about lightning striking, and it just does not really come together. I mean, we get this, yes, the lightning strikes, but then we get as the story goes on, it's about hair, and it just never really comes together in a solid and cohesive fashion. So we get a whole lot of setups, but there's no real payoff. So Jeff knows a lot about the Archie style, but he really does not understand the mechanics of comedy, because as a guy who writes comedy and has been doing it for a long time, I understand that when you're setting up a gag, you have to be able to hit that, have to time that joke, and you have to be able to hit that punchline so you can get that laugh. And this book, what it does is it sets up lots of gags. Unfortunately, those gags really never pay off, and when they do come around, they just don't really have that impact that they should, because they're not really well thought out. Now, there's three stories in this book, but a lot of them just don't. Again, this first story didn't really come together with a good joke. The second story really doesn't come together very well. This is about Riley and her friend Groovy going to this vintage store. They buy some vintage jacket, and this turns into another teen hijinks episode similar to Archie, but then it just falls completely apart, because while Jeff does a great job again setting up a gag, he can't really pay the gags off, and that's one of the big problems here. I mean, it's a good Archie comic. They will set a good gag up, but they will be able to pay the gag off with the ultimate punchline. Now, the third story has the same problems. The jokes just go on. This one is set in the Archie 1 period, and it's called Gold Rush. And another one, it sets up very strong, but the payoffs just aren't there. The comic timing just isn't there, and the gags just fall flat. So the big problems with this book are not the art. Again, the art is fantastic, the backgrounds are fantastic, the coloring, the lettering, all that stuff is rock solid, and the characters themselves are pretty well done. Just that the problem is that the writer really doesn't really set anything. With his setups, he sets up the gags, but then he doesn't understand about timing, he doesn't understand about punchlines, and he doesn't really understand delivery. And because he doesn't understand those concepts and how to make them work, we never get that big laugh that we used to get with Archie comics. And this is the big problem with this book, along with the cover. And if you're a new reader and you're going to buy this comic, your first impression of this book is, yeah, it captures the spirit of an old Archie comic. Unfortunately, there's no payoff, and the writing is just so uneven that you won't want to come back for the next book. So I bought this book on Kickstarter. I bought the paper edition. They emailed me the digital, but I don't know if I would want to come back for another issue of Way Out Life of Riley, because the writing is so far off the mark that I don't know if I want to come back for another issue. So it's a book that has some promise as related to the art, but the writing just needs a lot of work. I mean, as a writer who writes comedy, I would really say that Jeff really needs to go and really study the mechanics of how comedy works. I mean, read some old Archie Digest, especially some of the older ones by guys like Sam Schwartz, some of the Harry Lucy Archies, and read some of the classic Josie comics so he could get a good sense of how to do the classic DiCarlo style gags and make those gags work, because he's got good characters here. He has, good solid foundation in the style, but the things he needs to work on are his punchlines, because people, when they read a comic and they're looking for a laugh, they want a good payoff, and they want something that is going to make them laugh out loud. And we really do, in these dark times, need a good, funny comic. And I really wish this one could have knocked this one out of the park like previous independent comics I picked up. But this is one I really, after reading it, I can't recommend, because it's just not there yet. The art is there. Unfortunately, the stories still need a lot of work. But this is a guy who I believe has promise. And if he comes out with a second book and can show me that he can do gags, I would be glad to try to give him another chance to show me what he can do. But he has a lot of things that he needs to work on. I mean, I would have had a high school based cover, not an Archie 1 style cover, and I would have focused really on introducing this character in a way that made her fresh and exciting and made her a lot more fun and engaging than what I got in this book. Now, if you want to see me do more comic review videos, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to pick up some of my SJS Direct fantasy fiction, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, and books like the John Haynes series and the Spinsterella trilogy, you can find all of those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.
Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, ISIS, All That Glitters. The goddess next door takes on a bikini-clad bank robber in this action-packed, all-new ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS, All That Glitters in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today.